Welcome to the GCP-Mindset channel. Today I will talk about the fraud in clinical trials. More info after the intro.
Here I would like to mention several communication tips, what should be followed during the audit or the inspection. So what to do? I think you will probably agree, and if you have been already included in some audit, you already probably unintentionally realize these rules as a natural one. So to be professional, to be trustful all the times, and to be proactively listening. To be proactively listening, what is the auditor asking for or the inspector asking for? And in case it's not clear, just to make sure that you understand correctly to all the questions and their context before the answer is provided. Why it is important? In case you don't understand well, or the auditee or inspectee didn't understand well, which may quite easily happen on clinical sites, where not all staff is usually fluent in English, like study nurses or study coordinators or pharmacists may not be so fluent, and therefore it's always good to have clarification if they have properly understood the questions to answer them in a correct way. Also, it's a good in general, not only during the audits, but also in let's say a normal business life, is to focus on the positive aspects of the situation rather to getting the negative ones. Also, it's a good practice to limit the work-related discussions in the bathrooms or hallways or cafeterias, because you never know when the inspector is taking some small bio break, and it's not professional to spoke not only about the inspector or the auditor in these areas, but also about the projects themselves. Of course, like a clean desk policy is like a golden rule, because in case you don't follow such a simple rules to have a clean desk policy, or how to keep the confidential data stored, then it's such kind of also a sign to the auditor or the inspector that you may probably not follow all these rules, how to keep the data confidential during that particular clinical investigation. Yeah, and of course you should be familiar, or if you will be the auditee and the inspectee, you should be familiar with applicable SOPs, of course the project-related documentation or additional guidelines, and also regulatory requirements, and in the scope of delegated tasks. Definitely, if there will be questions which are out of your range of responsibilities, you should direct these questions to the proper persons. For example, if the study nurse is asked, how are the serious adverse events assessed from medical perspective, this is definitely not a question to study nurse, but this should be answered by the investigator. It should be a gold standard that all the training and background and qualification documentation is in place and updated. There are no clear rules from, let's say, ISO 14155 or other legislation sources, how often the CVs or the certificates need to be renewed. However, this could be easily cleared up by the sponsors' requirements. Nowadays, it's quite usual 2 years for the GCP training renew, or CV update every year, or 2 years, depending on the sponsor's requirements. And what's also important, in case you are providing some documents document copies to the auditor or the inspector, it's always good to know what you are providing to. It means that you need to perform some quality control review and make a list what is provided to the auditor or the inspector for any future references, for example, as part of the finding list in the audit report. And what not to do, it's also obvious that you should not guess or lie or deny the obvious or make misleading statements. Be always constructive is something which should be in place. So not to let the emotions in the communication and engage in unconstructive arguments. Also, not to respond to the questions which are outside your area, as I have also mentioned in the previous tips. And it's also fully recommended not to initiate your responses with the words like "I believe" or "I think," because this is something which provides your personal opinion. It's not a statement. And personal opinions are not the statements. You should provide the statements, and if you are not sure, you should first to check it and then to provide the statement. Depending on the inspector, to offer something which is extraordinary in terms of lunch or breakfast or some refreshment, it is something which is usually carefully cross-checked. Some companies have really strict rules what not to be provided, especially to FDA inspectors. However, from my own experience from FDA inspection, which took 5 days on site, it was because you are in so close relationship with the other human person during that inspection. I think it's quite normal to ask the inspector, is it fine to order some small lunch or some snacks for the lunch or some soft drinks, and it's depending on the inspector what he or she will choose. So during these 5 days, we had only one dinner in common. Otherwise, the inspector apologized, but it was not possible that she will join. And of course, she was more than welcome to have some snack during the day. Yeah, and I can also share with you the experience from the audits. I don't know, but during the last period of few years, I have observed personally that there is some trend that, I don't know, the people are somehow scared of hosting the audits or inspections, and they are not offering even a water or coffee. However, I think it's also fine just to mention, okay, so if you would like to have some coffee or water, downstairs is some cafeteria, you can buy it, you can leave it, and you can return it anytime. So that's something which could be quite easily communicated with the auditee and auditor, as well as inspectee and inspector, just to be transparent. What's the scope or what's the aim of the communication? And one important topic, last one, as a part, what not to do, is do not provide any original study documentation to the inspector to be taken away. Because then you will not have any original anymore. Usually the certified copy is provided, or a simple copy just signed, depending on the discussion with the inspector. Another experience from a clinical side in the Czech Republic, during the inspection, the inspector asked for copies of source documentation, including the patient names and patient identifiers and so on, and which was also accepted because they are regulatory authority which have rights to have these data collected as well. So therefore, there was no need to fully unblind these copies of source data. However, it was the principal investigator or delegated site staff responsibility to make these copies, to make the list of what was handed over to the inspectors, and to retain copies for their files. So, and what are the, let's say, areas the auditors and inspectors respond to? So just to little bit warn you what kind of areas may lead to the suspicion of the auditor or inspection that something is hiding or not let's say, explained or provided in transparent way. So in case there will be any attempts to restrict the access to source or study documentation, this is something which the auditors and inspectors do not like, because it seems that something is hidden. Again, from my own experience, during the audit of one CRO, there were the access to electronic trial master file granted for the review, because the scope of the audit was trial master file audit. However, during the review, it was recognized that some certain folders of final documents have not been accessed, or not the rights to these folders have not been granted to the auditor. And after clarification during the audit, it was not solved. So these rights have not been granted. And therefore, the audit can't be finished fully because the documents were not accessible. So therefore, it was also a part of a comment or a finding that it's restricted access, which is not a proper way. Also, in case of any major or significant and repeating inconsistencies with the clinical investigation plan or REACH requirements or the informed consent form processes, this is something which trigger more focus by the auditor and inspector to check it more deeply, if there are any additional systematic gaps or why this happened. In case the data, for example, on site are collected and recorded not in chronological order in the source documentation, it's also suspicious, because there could be also a potential scenario that these data have been completed retrospectively in case the validated electronic source documentation tool is not used and the audit trail is available or not available to confirm or verify how the data have been collected, by whom and when. In case everything is absolutely perfect on site, it's something which could also trigger a more focus of the auditor or inspector, because, as I said, we are all humans and all humans could make mistakes. And therefore, it's unbelievable in case you will have 20 patients or more on site and everything will be fully perfect without any crossed data, any correction or any omission. Then it may be also a potential source for review if there were no additional, let's say, falsification of data and so on. And just from my own experience from years ago, no clinical site or no auditee have been fully perfect, and that's normal. If the documentation is not self-explaining or transparent or according to Al-Classy principles, then it's also something which is quite often happening. However, it should not be in the way which is affecting the primary endpoint of the study or the critical process steps in the clinical investigation, because then if it is not transparent or self-explaining, then you don't have a real proof how the data have been collected and if the quality is as expected. In case you make the interviews with the auditee or the inspector, do the interviews with inspectee, and each member will respond completely differently or in the same learned way, then again it's something which trigger a future focus. What's behind it? And also, just in case you will host, let's say, an audit or inspection which will last for more days, and you receive or you request some documents or information which should be easily obtained and provided to auditor or inspector for review, and it took you much more time, then it's also something suspicious in terms of creation of the document or information, or it also shows that all the documentation is not properly available in the trial master file and need to be collected just simply on this request. Yeah, just to remember, so as I mentioned, all study documents has to be available in trial master file. The access to essential documents must be ensured, and also the access to primary source data must be ensured. I think we can have also one more example from recent series of audits for FDA triggered audits. There were study worksheets used on clinical sites because it was a very complicated study. However, some of the data have been transcribed to the worksheets from the primary source data. So just to remind the monitors that they need to always check these primary source data and not the data which have been transcribed to somewhere else, because then it's not a proper monitoring of primary data. So afterwards, the follow-up phase is starting, because after the audit and inspection is concluded, it's not the end, unfortunately. There are still a lot of things to do. So definitely after the audit as well as the inspection, some outcomes will reach the auditor or inspectee. It may differ, the whole report or some conclusions are shared depending on the practices. The audit certificate may be or may not be issued based on the processes of the auditor. And in both cases, in case there are issues and there are findings, the CAPA plan should be initiated. I just would like to highlight that prior to setting up the CAPA plan, the proper root cause analysis has to be performed. And because this is another topic which I can speak much more longer, this will be also one of the next webinar which we are planning to be focused how to perform the root cause analysis and how to plan the preventive and corrective action plans. So let's have a look into a few examples regarding audit and inspection findings. As I have mentioned from the Czech Regulatory Authority, which is a SUKL, here is a list of some inspection findings because they have shared these common findings during some seminar. I have to mention out that we have in the clinical investigations of medical devices, we have passed several inspections or tens of inspections, and we haven't received any findings so far. So knock knock, and to keep this further. And what was realized by the inspectors, you can see it here. It was like of evidence of training or deviations from the CIP, late reporting. This is also quite obvious, or the informed consent form was not signed properly, and so on and so on. After the discussion with the inspectors, how they plan the inspections, which site or which study should be inspected, they told me that they also already see during the application process, when you apply for the regulatory authority approval, they can see the quality of submitted documentation and also the quality of answers to their inquiries. And this is already the first trigger for potential inspection. Regarding EMA inspection findings, you can find all the information on their EMA web pages. For example, there are two complex reports. One is providing the data from 12 years and almost 400 inspections. And then also the report from the year 2018, where almost 100 of inspections have been performed. Just for your information, here is the overview, how many inspections have been performed during the years, and if they were triggered or considered as a routine. As you can see, the trend is starting to increase the number of inspections after 2007. Which has also impact because in 2006, the EMA created their own inspection guidelines, how to perform such kind of inspections. And in comparison from these two reports, you can see, of course, that the main interest is to inspect the clinical investigator and afterwards the sponsor. However, the trend is slightly moving to increase the inspections and the sponsor and CRO side, and to decrease the number of inspections on clinical investigator sides. So that's the current trend observed based on the EMA data. And there is also a comparison regarding the number and percentages of findings by grading. So from the first report until 2012, you can see that the critical findings were in 9%, while in the report from 2018, there were 6% of critical findings. However, the total number of major findings slightly increased because, the critical findings decreased compared to the report until 2012. And if EMA provided the additional details regarding the total findings on the investigator responsibility, you can see that the major part is regarding reporting the data in case report forms or diaries and source documentation, followed by essential documents. While on the sponsor side, the majority of the findings are related to the monitoring, and subsequently essential documents and data management. And when taking into considerations shared responsibility of the sponsor and the investigator, on the first place, it were the findings from essential documents, followed by the data reported in CRF and source documentation. For the FDA inspections, on their web pages, there are data dashboards where you can, let's say, select any kind of data you would like to check out. So, for example, this is a general graph providing the information how many domestic and foreign inspections have been performed since 2009. It's not surprising that in the last 2 years, the trend of performing the inspections is decreasing because of COVID. However, I have to also mention that FDA started to perform much more remote inspections comparison to the era prior to the COVID. Regarding the indications, if you are not familiar with the classification, so the green one is no action indicated. The red one is official action indicated, which means that the inspectee needs to respond to the observations and findings. And then there is the voluntary action indicated. So in a total view, there were majority of no actions indicated. However, there are still some official action indicated, but it's slightly still decreasing, which is, I think, good. And there are also, you can also filter out the data depending on the product type, if it is devices or drugs or veterinary medicines. And because FDA also covered the foods and cosmetics, of course, there are a lot of inspections performed in this area. And you can also find all the details regarding the individual inspections. So if you select, for example, that you are looking for the data from 2021 for medical devices in a respective country, you can filter out all these data. Here are the examples for the Czech Republic and Germany. Just to have an overview what kind of data you can extract from FDA data sets, including if there were any actions indicated or not. And it's not only in blinded way that there were some inspections performed and that some actions have been indicated. However, you can again filter out who was the auditee or inspectee, and what kind of findings have been described. And therefore, again, you can filter out according to the country, according to the program, if it is like for devices. And then you can also find maybe one of your client there. And just to identify if there were any gaps, you may also help out to the client to how to avoid it in the future. So, and the potential impacts of the audits and inspections are that, of course, the sponsor should decide on him or herself what will be the final decision. And there are a variety of decisions which could be done. So either to terminate the investigator participation in the study or close the site or close the vendor or suppliers or the whole clinical investigation or investigation in some certain region or country. Also to provide some financial sanctions, especially to on employees or the vendors or suppliers based on the contracts, approach to labor sanctions or initiate criminal proceedings. However, for the inspections impact, potential impacts, which are considered also as a more major than from the audits, because they could become public, and it in the public awareness in a negative way. Also, it may lead to the prohibition of activities or some fines or administrative offenses. So therefore, that's the reason why we always treat any inspection which is announced at GCPS projects as serious, and we don't underestimate the situation, and not only the inspection readiness, but also to verify and confirm the preparation. So, and few last points to remember. So be ready to keep the audit and inspection readiness all the time. What is not documented didn't happen. It's also one of the golden rule in clinical research. Issues, if happen, need to be solved immediately. The communication need to be open and transparent and cooperative, and to keep the trial oversight. And my last picture for today is to show you that on several examples that the auditors and inspectors are usually experienced enough to identify what they have in front of their eyes. And if the audit or inspection lasts longer than 1 day, then they will be able to identify what is on your playground. So that was everything from my side. And if you have any questions, you can reach me out.
Thanks for watching.